Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of First Samuel. Today we are in chapter 22. Recall yesterday, and we have discovered some of the actions and antics of David as he was running away for his dear life from Saul. And he had involved Ahimelech, the priest, at Nob. And then after that, he picked up the sword of Goliath, and then he ran off to Gath, to the territory of the Philistines. And the king of Gath was in his sight. The servants got hold of him and he feigned madness. And that was what we read as we ended chapter 21. Now in chapter 22, he leaves Gath. All right. So David departed from there. The idea here of departed is a very simple word. He walked. Now, in those days, they don't ride horses. You would always find that when they ride horses, it has always been with regards to war. But in a normal course of life, they actually do a lot of walking. So he walked from there. There would be Gath. And there he escaped to the cave of Adullam. The idea here, escape, would be to slip away. So he didn't want to have any confrontation with Achish, the king of Gath, and so he slipped away to the cave of Adullam. Now we don't know quite where Adullam is, but it is, well, I guess many people think of it as uh, a lowland cave by the side of a hill. And David hid there. And while he hid there, seems that news came to his brothers and all his father's household. And they went there to him. So think of it this way. His father and his brother heard. And so there were news that was circulating. And so the brothers, the ones that despised him, and all his father's household, perhaps the servants too, and they went down there. Now, this is important, down there, as what we had thought of the cave of Adullam could be on the slopes of the hill, in a, I suppose, in a lower part of Judah, in the lower part of Judah. Verse 2, everyone, now besides the brothers and the father's household, you find that there was a gathering, right? There was a gathering. Who were there? All who was in distress. And the idea of distress, it means that these are people who have been, I should say, how do you explain this? Let's see. These are people who are stressed, I guess, who are not having a normal life, perhaps, who are oppressed. Maybe we could say that, oppressed or persecuted. Right? That's one way of looking at it. Then everyone who was in debt. In debt means they have a creditor. They owe money to another. And everyone who was discontented. Now, the idea of discontented appears to be, I guess you can say this is, they are bitter. They have a bitterness of spirit. This is the meaning of discontented. Everyone, and this basically tells us these three groups of people are the outcasts, the less fortunate, the oppressed. I could think of it this way. Uh, and these were not your warriors, I guess. These are not your warriors. These are people who has lost a lot. I would think that we could read it that way. They came to him. So they gathered, uh, he gathered to him, whom him would be David, and David became the chief over them. Now, understand that this was also quite interesting that these were the people who heard of David and they were the ones who were willing to join David. Perhaps you could also see that these were people who has nothing to lose. Do not owe king any favors, because we're talking about Saul versus David here. Now, for all intents and purposes, Saul is still the king. And as a king of the land, he has overall power. That's why the term Elohim is also used for a king, mainly because he has ultimately a lot of power over the people. What he wants can be done, including taking the life of another, like how Saul had decided that he would want David to be killed. And so he would lay down the orders and so it will be carried out. And so this verse 2 is to contrast the people who joined up with David are the ones who have nothing to lose. They owe people money, they are oppressed, they are maybe the less fortunate, but they saw something in David that they were willing to give their lives to. And so he became chief, Tsar, over them. And there were about 400 men with him. Now, in this case, you find that this would be the male gender. In the ancient days, you don't find women coming out, and the men will come out to defend David. That would be how we would read this phrase. Now, moving on to verse 3. In verse 3, from the low-lying areas of Judah in the cave of Adullam, David went from there to Mitzpeh of Moab. Now he crossed over the Jordan to the other side now. This would also mean that it is a place where Saul himself will not cross, because that would be in a different sovereignty, if you can think of it that way. And so David said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother come and be with you." And the idea here is to be in the land until I know what God will do for me. Now, the king of Moab likely will know who God is, if you want to say it that way, because Jehovah is actually a well-known God of that entire land because of Israel. And in that conversation, David uses God, his God, and this would be David's God. Notice that the kings over those days, everybody has gods, and the king of Moab has gods and goddesses. And he left them there in, I guess you could say, for safety purposes. right, for safety purposes. He left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all that time that David was in the uh, in the Metsuda, right? Metsuda. This is really a fortress. Uh, and this is really at a place where David was preparing to plan for his next course of action. Now, what we are seeing is a narrative of a king to be anointed, running for his life from Saul in a foreign land of Moab with a king who might be his enemy. But he had to trust somebody, and it could not be Achish. Now it has to be the king of Moab. In verse 5, we now have another prophet, the prophet Gad. The prophet Gad came to David. Now we are at a time when Samuel was still around, and he must have been quite old by then. But we have another prophet that comes out into the narrative, and the prophet tells David not to stay in the stronghold, the Matsuda. So he should walk and go back into the land of Judah. So the stronghold is still in Moab. And so David departed and went into the forest of Horet. Horet. Horet would also be in Judah, right? In Judah. Now we don't know exactly where this site is now. It is a place, although it's called a forest, it would be a place where there are many trees. I think that would be an easier way to understand that, right? A place of many trees. In verse 6, after all these narratives that we know of David making his way from Gath to Adullam in the cave, and then he had his entourage of now 400 men with him. So he has a little army. He goes over to the Masuda in Moab. He hands over his parents into the protection of the king of Moab. And now, by the advice of God, the prophet at the time as well, where there was still Samuel, but he was still old, God told him to now leave. Now, Saul comes back into the picture. So Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now, what does this mean in the Hebrew? First, here. So news travels very fast in those days. He heard that David and the men, 400 of them, who were with him, has been discovered. The word discovered is known, right? It was known. So the English word is used in this case because it is a English style. Discovered is to have made known or being made known as what we will call a passive voice. Now, Saul, where was Saul? Saul was in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree. Now, we don't know what kind of tree. It's a big tree on the Ramah. This word height is Ramah. Very much similar in name to the place where Samuel would have been, with a spear in his hand, waiting for David. And all his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants who stood around him, and he has some very interesting words to say. Hear now, O Benjamites. So first thing that we know is that his servants, the soldiers, are from Benjamin, because he's staying in the territory of Benjamin. Only when you go to war, where you where you draft up all the men from the other tribes. So when you are staying with in his own territory of the area of the Benjamites, he would have the Benjamites as his army. Then he says, will the son of Jesse also give to you all the fields and vineyards? Now, the son of Jesse would be David. And Saul is now comparing himself to David. That now that you are the servants of Saul, you have fields and you have vineyards. Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? It is to briefly say that David is a nobody, a renegade. He has a renegade army. He is running away for his life, so to speak. Verse 8. Now he is now really upset. Now this word here, for all of you have conspired. The idea of conspiring is really to bind together their decisions, I think would be a good way of looking at it. Bind together their decisions. It says against me. I think you could say towards me would be maybe a better way of explaining it. Towards me. So they are all having a same idea, and this is against or towards Saul, in a way that no one discloses to me. Discloses means, well, the idea here is uncover. I guess you could say that reveal, right? No one is revealing to me that when my son makes a pact, this idea here is the word cut, the word make is cut, and the word covenant is not there in the Hebrew, but by implications, you only cut a covenant, a berit. And so that is why the covenant is added in. So when my son cut with the son of Jesse, that's David, my son and the son of Jesse, and there is none of you who is sorry for me. Basically, he's saying nobody is feeling, how should we say? I think it's good. Feeling sorry is good, but sometimes you might misunderstand this. Feeling sorry would be grieved. That nobody, we can say that nobody really cared. None of you really cared for Saul. Nobody actually revealed to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush. My servant, David, right? David, to lie in ambush. This idea here is he's thinking that he is lurking, lie in wait, right? Hiding as of this day. So you can think about it is that the soldiers were siding Jonathan. And Jonathan in turn was siding David. And all of this is against Saul. And hence Saul was very, very upset. Now, this is the emotions that's now building up because of how Saul feels that he is now kind of standalone. He is king. and yet his people are not siding him, are not listening to him. Now, in verse 9, we now look at this character, Doeg. Doeg, the Edomite that we read in chapter 21, he so happened to be in Nov in chapter 21, recognizing David as well, and has somehow heard that conversation between David and Ahimelech. Now, he was standing by the servants of Saul, and he made this announcement. I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nov, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahituph, or Ahitoph. He inquired of the Lord for him. Now, watch these words. He inquired of the Lord for him. Let's go through this first. Gave him provisions, bread, gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. Now, I just want to draw your attention to this. He inquired of the Lord for him. Did we actually read that in chapter 21? And we actually did. We read of the sword. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 21 and in verse 9. It says that the sword of Goliath was wrapped in cloth. And then we read in the English these words, behind the ephod. But the word behind was after. I had highlighted it yesterday that this means after the ephod. And what this actually meant, and based on yesterday, was that there was the Umim and the Tumim, of which it was to seek God's decision. Now that is the way that it is described, or at least in the Hebrew, that David picked up the sword after Ahimelech had consulted God and then gave him the sword. And so in verse 10, it now confirms that Ahimelech had actually inquired, asked of God for David. And Ahimelech gave David the bread. The provision here means food. And gave him the sword of the Philistine. And so what you can actually see is that this is a recount of what Doeg actually saw and now is reporting to the king. Right? Reporting to the king. What do you think Saul would have felt? So in the narrative, we would begin to see that the king would be extremely upset because the priest had actually taken the side of David, or at least so the King Saul thought. And Doeg basically explained what he saw. Then the king, this would be Saul, as king, he sent somebody to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahituph, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. And this would be in Ramah, the hills of Ephraim. Now this one, send someone to call. Now remember the word send. This is to act on behalf. It's a very powerful word in Hebrew. When the king sends somebody, this somebody will be speaking on behalf of the king and will, for all intents and purposes, represent Saul. It's very much like the ancient Chinese emperors. He would send the imperial edict, the Sengzi, that all the people will have to bow and listen to what is said and do exactly as told, because it would be as if the emperor said it. And so when this person goes to Ahimelech, it would be as if Saul spoke. So all of them came. Who do we have? We have Ahimelech. We have everyone in the family. And then we had the priests who were in Nov. And this is a very dangerous situation. Saul said, listen. Saul said to them. Saul said to them, who are they? All of these, 1, 2, and 3, right? He says, listen now, son of Ahituph. Right here, everyone, son of Ahituph. And he answered, here I am, my Adoni. So understand when it's in when a human person is addressing somebody more powerful, this word Lord is Adoni. It would be my Lord, where it is not with regards to God himself. The charge that Saul set to him. Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me? So now we have Ahimelech and David conspired. Again, you would see this as bind together. He had said these to the servants, the Benjamites. Why did you come together and stood against me with Jonathan? Never told me what Jonathan said. Now, in this case, he's now talking to Ahimelech. Says that you have given him bread and a sword. And this particular one as well inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush as of this day. So what does that mean? Again, inquired of God for him literally means ask of God, activated the Umim and Tumim, as we had seen in verse 10. So it would appear that Saul had not been able to seek God, and has not been able to receive any instructions anymore from God. Samuel physically would not go to see him. And so Saul sits by himself in Ramah, and he is now feeling very isolated because his son Jonathan is against him. His soldiers, who are the Benjamites, have hidden from him. And now the priests, the ones who know what to do, are no longer for him. And that's how the story is building up. Verse 14, Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants is as faithful as David? And so Ahimelech defends David, saying that he is faithful. He is always upholding Saul. even that he is the king's son-in-law. He is all you can say here, he is the captain over your guard and is honored in your house. Everybody loved David, if you recall in the earlier chapters. Verse 15. Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Now, what does this mean? Did I start? This word is to start, to ask of God for him today. That is not the case. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant, and this would be Ahimelech. Right? This would be Ahimelech. Notice the style of speech, right? Everybody is a servant to the king. And so everybody is humbly addressing themselves as a servant to the king. Now, in ancient Malay customs, they would use the word hamba. That would be very consistent in a very oriental way. Your servant, or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. When it says this whole affair, means whatever is said, whether big or small, right? Whether big or small. I know nothing of it. However, the reply from the king says this. But the king said, you shall surely die. This is a very powerful statement. Why? Because he is a king. He can say that. He is the authority of the land. And so when he says, you shall surely die, you will surely die. And he declares that this is to Ahimelech, you and all your father's household. Verse 17, and the king said to the guards who were attending him, turn around and put the priest of the Lord to death. This is the idea of surely die, right? They are destined to die because their hand also is with David. So notice body parts are very popular in Hebrew discourse. Hand is a hand of fellowship, a hand of relationship. Their hand of whatever they do is with David, not with Saul. And that is the crime. Not with Saul. And because they knew that he was fleeing or running away, did not uncover or disclose to me. Now remember, these were the servants, the guards who were attending him, were the Benjamites whom Saul had said that you are all conspiring against me, that you did not tell me that my son Jonathan had cut a covenant with the son of Jesse. So the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. So again, their hands where it is about action, right? Their action, their support, their authority. They are not going to strike, to attack, to strike the priests of the Lord. So they actually know the Kohanei Jehovah. Understand, in the society at large, remember, I just redraw this chart for you again. We have God, then we have king. These are all the servants. And right here, we have the priests. and next to him would be the prophet. So with this, you find that the priests are serving God. They have a special role, and yet when they do not obey the king, or they do not side the king is now having them killed, knowing full well that they serve God primarily because of the tabernacle, and they refuse. So the servants, the soldiers there, would not. Now we have Doeg. Doeg is not part of his army, and Doeg was the one who exposed Ahimelech. So then you turn around and you attack the priests. You strike them, right? You strike them. You turn around and you strike them dead. And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priest, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And these were clearly the priests. The priests of the Lord died. Not only that, in verse 19, he struck Nov, the city of the priests. That's where the tabernacle is. And with the edge of the sword, he attacked both men, women, children, and infants, oxen, donkeys, sheep. He struck with the edge of the sword. And this is Doeg. This would be sheer annihilation. This is annihilation of Ahimelech. And then we find in verse 20, but one son of Ahimelech, Ahitoph, his name is Aviatar. Aviatar. He fled, he escaped and fled. And this word after David is exactly the word behind the ephod. It is after the ephod, after the consultation of the Urim and Thummim in chapter 21. Same word, he came after or behind David. So going to where David was. And Eviatar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Verse 22. Then David said to Eviatar, and it is interesting now that let's observe the statements that David made. David says, I knew on the day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul. And David was very sad and remorseful. He says, I have brought about, or I have turned, right? Turned every person in your father's household. I have turned every person in his father's, every nephesh. It's nephesh that will die, right? So we're talking about the death of the father's household. And so this is regrettable. By David. But it was done. Verse 23. So David is now taking Aviatar together with him. He says, stay with me. This word stay means to dwell or to sit with me. He says, do not be afraid. This word is yara. Yara. Yara is to be afraid, to fear. Do not fear. Right? Do not fear. He says, for those who are seeking you, those who are looking for you, and this word seek, we have seen this word before. It is to look, to find, right? Those who are looking for my life seeks your life. Now, understand that these words here uses a very interesting Hebrew word. The word life is nephesh. Seeks your nephesh. Your every nephesh in your father's household died. So whenever you talk about nephesh, it's about life and death as well. And so David says, you are safe with me. The word with me is in my company. In my company. I think this can also be understood uh, that if you are standing with me. And so that's how David expresses this safety. The act of safety is, I guess, is given him a sense of confidence that David knows what he's doing. And then if Aviatar or Aviatar stays with David, he will also be saved because David knows how to protect his own life. And so we saw yesterday as he was running away, he is very good and he has all the intelligence and wisdom to make sure that he doesn't die along the way. And now he's got 400 people and he would know what to do to protect himself. And that is what verse 23 is all about. And to tell this surviving member of the household of Ahimelech that he will be saved with David because David knows what to do and God is with him as well. And with this, we come to the end of chapter 22.